Well, 3B, welcome back for this second video on the topic of evolution. If we say something like evolution, what we generally mean now, or what we say that evolution is the descent with modification. So there is heritage, and with the heritage comes modifications. So that's why we call evolution. These modifications, so changes, are random. There's nothing uh, predicted or prepared. There's nothing written for it or so. It's just random. And those modifications in the descent, it goes by three means. It goes by means of mutation in the DNA. It goes by the theory of isolation and the theory of natural selection or survival of the fittest. More about that later. Of course, the name that pops up in your head when I say evolution is Charles Darwin. About him. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and he published his book on the origin of species in 1859. And he was born in Catholic England, so it's kind of controversial, the study he did. His father, he was very interested in nature already as a young boy, but his father wanted him to be a surgeon, so he sent him to Cambridge Medical School. And he dropped out because he thought that medical school was kind of boring. It was only about people, and he was more interested in nature in all its beauty and all its forms. And he also found it was horrific because in that time they had no means of sedating people, so anesthesiasts were not there. So surgery was very painful and very horrifying. So he came up with his ideas during his life. But the idea itself that life developed not from a creationist or that organisms change is actually very old. Already Aristotle thought about it, and he called it the scala naturae. And it's in his idea there's a ladder, and on the lowest sports of this ladder, there are very simple organisms, and high above there are the humans or even the gods in his idea. So you can climb up on this ladder if you did something or so. I'm not very I don't know very well. Later on in the 1750s, we had a scientist from Sweden called Carl Linné. You might have heard of him. He later called himself Carolus Linnaeus because he thinks that in that era, everybody thought that Latin was the most coolest language in the world. So everybody who was smart, they learned Latin, and they changed their names as well. So Carl Linné, he came up with this binomial system, and the binomial system is what we use today to name organisms. So, for example, we are Homo sapiens. So, for example, oak trees are Quercus robur, and so on and so on. So then he related organisms and he divided organisms into different taxons. So the way he related things to each other was merely based on the looks of it, of course, and now we do it on DNA sequencing and all. But you get that this is already the basis of an idea that life was not created by something. All right. So Darwin, when he dropped out of medical school, he started to study fossils because he found that really interesting. So you could call him a paleontologist. So that's paleo is very old. So it studies the old very old biology. He was inspired by other paleontologists like Cuvier in the 1800s and later Hutton and Lyell. Those three scientists, they concluded that the deeper and older the layer of the earth, the more different are the fossils you will find. And they're more different from nowadays animals. So Darwin formed the idea that Earth was maybe older than 6,000 years, as stated in the Bible. And that idea was very controversial because in the day, everybody, or not everybody, but almost everybody, believed literally what was said in the Bible. Well, when Darwin was studying, there was this opportunity to go on a trip, and there was the voyage of the Beagle. the Beagle was the HMS Beagle. It was a ship, and the goal of that ship was to map the Southern American coastline. And this trip was not a small trip. It took 5 years. And it went everywhere. And if you want to see where it all went, you can see it, figure 12, page 177 in your book. One of at a certain moment, around in the last year or so, I'm not really sure, they stumbled upon volcanic islands. And those volcanic islands were at the west of the Southern America, as we know today, and we know it as the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Isles are very famous for Darwin, in regard to Darwin, because Charles Darwin found a lot of different birds there, and he was triggered by those kinds of finches he found, because he encounters also the same kind of birds in Southern America, and these ones they remarkably looked like it, but they all had different beaks, and so he concluded that maybe on the Isles were different sources of food, and therefore he concluded that they had to adapt their beaks to the type of food. So if you have a beak which is suited for eating insects, and there are no insects on that isle, then it's very hard to find food. I have a picture here. So there is a cactus eater, an insect eater, and a seed eater. And you see the insect eater differs a lot from the seed eater. So if you're an insect eater on an isle where there are almost no insects, then you'll die, right? And if you're a seed eater but there are no seeds, then you die as well. So here you go, here you have it, survival of the fittest by adaptation. If you adapt to the situation on the island where you are, then you will have enough food, and then you will survive, right? So there you go. So this is one of the examples for an argument that states that evolution is true. So the finches adapted by means of natural selection. There is natural selection. It's random if there are seed-growing trees or not, right? And those finches adapted to it, and therefore became other species. All right. So are there more arguments now to support evolution? Yes, there are. There are a lot of arguments. For example, if it's a kind of recent thing, if you look at a certain bacteria, it's called the Streptococcus aureus. It's already an old bacterium, but it's a pathogen, and it means that it can make you ill. If you're infected with Streptococcus aureus, you get very ill. At a certain time, they discovered penicillin, and it's an antibiotic. And if you give it to people, then it will kill off those bacteria. In the penicillin, there's a substance called methicillin, and when there was a time that everybody got treated with antibiotics for everything. So you had the flu, antibiotics. You had a broken leg, antibiotics. Because antibiotics are super medicines, right? They work for everything, and they protect you against infections. But it turns out that bacteria, they're not so stupid after all. So they evolved, they adapted to the environment, which was very hostile for them. The penicillin, the antibiotics, the methicillin, it was very hostile for them. So there were mutations in their DNA, and those mutations, they led to Streptococcus aureus, which was resistant against the methicillin. And therefore, they changed from a normal Streptococcus aureus into an MRSA, a multi-resistant or methicillin-resistant Streptococcus aureus. And nowadays, MRSA is a very, very, very dangerous bacteria. If a hospital is infected with MRSA, it has to be quarantined totally and has to be cleansed off even more than it is now with the coronavirus, with SARS-CoV-2. And this is very, very dangerous, because if people are infected with MRSA, there is absolutely no cure, right? So to get a link to what's happening nowadays, when you are infected with SARS-CoV-2, you could develop the disease COVID-19, which is, of course, very bad, and you don't want it, right? But your body still can fight it, right? It can still make antibodies against it, and eventually, in a few years, we come up with a vaccine, which gives us the right antibodies to fight it, right? But for MRSA, the cure was an antibiotic. But the antibiotics don't work anymore because they evolved into very resistant things, right? So the development of Streptococcus aureus into MRSA is therefore an argument for evolution. Another argument for evolution is the homology in vertebrate bones. I can show you. I think I have a screenshot. No, it's not that screenshot. It's this one. Yeah, it's this one. Right. So if you look here, all the purple ones are the humeri. So this is a humerus from humans, and here a humerus from cats, from whales, from bats. Same goes for the radius, ulnocarpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So if you look at those bones, for example, let us take the radius. You see that all of these animals, they have two bones in the lower arm. They all have a radius and an ulna. Okay, they might look different, but they are the same bones. So the conclusion to this is that we have a common ancestor. So there are ancestors to humans, cats, whales, and bats, which are the same animals, right? And that's why I told you in the last video about when vertebrates developed. It was in the Ordovician, about 450 million years ago. In the Ordovician, there the basic structure of an arm was developed, and it's still used, right, in different forms, but it still is the same homology. Homology also happens in embryos. If you compare embryos of tortoises, chickens, humans at a certain stage, let's say after a month or so, they look exactly the same. If they develop more, then they will change, of course, and one will become a tortoise, the other will become a chick, and the other one will become a human, right? But in the early stages, they are the same. So those homologies is very striking. Yeah. So another argument to state this is the metabolism in eukaryotes. So you know that plants do photosynthesis, right? And we do respiration. Remember, we use some oxygen to burn some glucose to get carbon dioxide, water, and of course energy. Well, it happens in every eukaryote, so every plant, every fungi, and every animal. It happens the same way. It also happens in mitochondria. Mitochondria itself are actually bacteria which live inside our cells. Okay. Then we have some vestigial or rudimentary organs we don't use anymore. For example, in your eye, go look at it. In your eye, you have here you have an eyelid, and here you have an extra eyelid. It's called your reptile eyelid. And you can't close it anymore, but it was there to protect you against sand and water, right? We have cecums, the parts of our intestines that we don't use anymore. We have certain tendons in our hand and in our arms that there's no use for anymore. For example, snakes have hip bones. They don't have legs, but they have hip bones, right? It all gives the idea there is a common ancestor to all of those animals. And that states that's an argument for evolution. That's why it's so true. And then the last thing we have to mention is carbon dating. So if you dig up fossils, right, and you look at fossils, you find carbon atoms there. And those carbon atoms, you can measure them for radiation. And the radiation it gives off, it decays over time, right? It's very common knowledge with ionizing radiation, but it also happens in everything else. So carbon dating, if there's less radiation coming from that carbon, then you can tell how old it is, and you can see that a fossil is, for example, 200,000 years old or so. Okay, time's up for this video. I'd like to close off. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you do well, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.